everyone. I hope you have had a wonderful Easter season so far. And we are back in the book of Numbers today for our weekly Bible reading video. And this week we get a look at the end of this first generation that God brought up out of Egypt into the desert on their way to the promised land. They have continued to make poor choices, to go against what God has called them to do, to complain against God, and they finally are going to turn to idolatry and unfortunately be completely wiped out, and God is going to start over with this new generation. And we are at the very boundary of the first generation. And so these are some difficult stories to read, as we've encountered all throughout the book of Numbers. But there is a little ray of hope that comes at the end of this. And interestingly enough, when we look at the prophecies of Balaam, these prophecies give a bright outlook for the people of Israel, for their future, even while this first generation is passing away. The first story that we come to in our reading this week is the story of the bronze serpent. And this is a very odd story to us, mostly because when you think of the second commandment, is a prohibition against any kind of graven image, any kind of metal or stone idol. And while the bronze serpent isn't in and of itself an idol, it is very easy to see how these Israelites who have fallen prey to so many different temptations, how they might be tempted to see this bronze serpent as an idol, especially as they are brought healing through looking at this bronze serpent. So what is God doing here by commanding Moses to make this serpent and to hold it up for the people to see? First of all, we do need to recognize that there are some cultural elements in this that are very far away from our cultural understanding. Serpents were seen in Egyptian culture and in the ancient Near Eastern cultures as a source of healing, even though they were also seen as very dangerous animals. And it is possible that there were some medicines that were produced using some sort of venom or something from the snake that was then used medicinally, transformed from its negative properties to positive properties. So there may already be this sense of familiarity between the serpent and healing. Also, there's obviously the fact that the serpent is what is causing this great disease, this great illness in the people, because they are being bitten by these serpents. And so this also connects with an ancient Near Eastern practice that's called sympathetic healing, this belief that if you looked at a symbol of the disease, it would somehow protect you from the evil forces of those diseases. But all of those things really sound like superstitions. And again, it is the Lord himself who is telling Moses to lift up this bronze serpent. I think the best thing for us to do in our situation today, with the benefit of having hindsight, with the benefit of having the New Testament in front of us, is to look at this passage in the way it is looked at by Jesus himself. Jesus references this passage when he is having his conversation with Nicodemus, and he is talking about how, just like Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, I, Jesus, will be lifted up for the salvation of humankind. And so Jesus is using this story specifically to point to his own sacrifice on the cross, when he is lifted up for our healing, for our salvation, for us to be made whole. But why the serpent imagery? Well, if you remember back to the very beginning of Genesis, it was the serpent who tempted the first humans into sin, and the serpent has become a symbol of sin. Jesus, we read in the New Testament, was one who had no sin, and yet he took on our sin to conquer our sin and to bring us healing and salvation from that sin. Jesus is the one who is being lifted up and is taking the curse of the serpent upon himself. And so this bronze serpent in the wilderness, through our New Testament eyes and our lens of Jesus Christ, makes sense to us as a type of Jesus, one of those symbols that we've talked about before that foreshadows what Jesus will do for us. We have all been bitten by the curse of sin, and Jesus has taken that curse upon himself to free us and to save us. We then get a little glimpse of hope for the Israelites as they have their first military victories against these nations that are not in the promised land per se. They are on the other side of the Jordan River. This will become a part of the nation of Israel, which we'll see later on in the book of Numbers. But this is not initially that land of Canaan, but they are facing off against Moab and the Amorites, and they are having these first military victories against these great kings and these great established civilizations. And so you get this feeling like, okay, God is leading them into some success, and they are going to maybe start to correct the course. Maybe this first generation, there is hope for them. But we have to remember that God is going to keep his promise, and that the victories of these Israelite warriors in the first generation, those victories are not due so much to them and their faithfulness as they are to God and God's grace and God's power and God's faithfulness. God is not going to stop being powerful and faithful just because this first generation has been faithless. And so remember that any success that the Israelites have, it is because of God and God alone. We then leave the Israelites for this extended portion of the story of Balaam. Now, Balaam is an interesting figure in that he is not an Israelite, and yet he clearly knows the Lord. He speaks the name of the Lord. He is able to receive prophetic visions and utterances from the Lord. He is someone who is connected to God. And in these passages, we see some of those names for God that are used throughout the book of Genesis and used by those who knew of the Lord even before the Israelites became a people. So you get Balaam referring to the Lord or to Yahweh. You get Balaam referring to the Most High or Elyon. God the Most High is El Elyon, and that is used in the book of Genesis as well. We also see Balaam referred to the Almighty or Shaddai, El Shaddai, God the Almighty. That is how God is referenced also in the book of Genesis. And so we get this sense that Balaam is someone who is very close to the kind of worship that Abraham would have been familiar with. Someone who knows the one true God, but is outside of a covenant community, is outside of the Israelite people. So is Balaam sort of like Melchizedek? Remember, Melchizedek was also a priest to the Lord, although Balaam is a prophet, but he was a priest to the Lord. He was someone who knew about the worship of God, the God of Abraham, and he was able to connect the people of God to the Lord. And in a sense, even though Balaam doesn't have any interactions with the Israelites in these passages, he is connecting them to the Lord. Well, we'll see later on where Balaam is not quite the same sympathetic figure as Melchizedek became. He's not quite the figure that would be lifted up as a paradigm of faithfulness like Melchizedek. But he does, in the stories that we're reading this week, have an obvious connection to the Lord, and he is able to speak on the Lord's behalf, even to the point where he refuses, when the king asks him to curse Israel 3 times, he refuses to do that because he says, I can only speak what the Lord tells me to speak. Interestingly enough, Balaam is a name that has been found in archaeological records in what is now the country of Jordan, which is similar in geography to the place we're talking about right now on this other side of the Jordan River. In fact, those areas of Moab and places like that are part of modern-day Jordan. And there have been some inscriptions in which a prophet named Balaam has been attested to. However, it does seem that this name Balaam was a sort of a general name for a prophet. And perhaps the Israelites are being blessed here by the exact same Balaam that has been attested to in the archaeological record, although the timelines don't match up too much. Or maybe the name is simply standing in for a foreign prophet. What is the significance of a foreign prophet blessing Israel? It gives some validity to the fact that Israel is the rightful occupants of the land. That even if a foreigner can recognize that they are blessed by God, then how can anyone else doubt that they are God's people of promise? And so there is a chance here that the writers and the editors of Numbers took this recognizable name of Balaam and applied that name to this situation, to these readings, to give some legitimacy, some international legitimacy to their place and their rightful ownership or rightful occupancy of this land. This also shows that the Lord is independent of Israel. That is an important truth to remember. Israel is not independent of the Lord. Israel is completely dependent on the Lord. But the Lord is not dependent on Israel. In fact, the Lord is the Lord and God of all nations and all peoples. And so to have this foreign prophet connected to the Lord reminds us that the Lord is raising Israel up so that the whole world might be blessed. You know, we see in these passages a lot of bloodshed, a lot of war between the Israelites and other nations, and we might get this idea, this false idea, that the Lord is only interested in the Israelites and their prosperity. And we forget that the whole reason why the Lord is working in this culture of warfare, the whole reason he is working to build up this promised people, is so that the whole world might be blessed. If Israel is blessed by the Lord, then the Balaams of the world will also find blessing in the Lord. Then the people who come to be known as the Gentiles might find blessing in the Lord. So that people like you and me might find blessing in the Lord. The Lord is the God of all people. He is not owned by the Israelites. He is not controlled by the Israelites. And he's not dependent on the Israelites. They are dependent on him as they are used by him lovingly and graciously to save the whole world. We, of course, have this great story of Balaam and his donkey in our passages this week, where we get to see the donkey receive this supernatural ability to speak, but also to see the angel of the Lord on the pathway. And we could get into all the details of this story and the details of Balaam's blessings and not being able to curse the people of God. But what's more important to see is this overarching theme of seeing the Lord and then speaking on his behalf. Balaam is connected to the Lord and he speaks on the Lord's behalf. The donkey, even when Balaam the prophet is not able to see the Lord, the donkey can see the Lord and the evidence of the Lord and can speak on his behalf. How important it's going to be for the people of God to see God and see God at work so they can speak on his behalf, speak words of truth and words of blessing. It's important for us as the church today to have open eyes and open hearts so that we can see and receive from the Lord, so that we can speak a word of blessing and hope for the world around us. Notice that God's message, all of these 4 messages that Balaam speaks on behalf of the Lord, the 3 blessings that he gives in response to the king's desire to curse Israel, and then this final blessing he gives unprompted, all of those give hope to the people. Even while this first generation is passing away, God wants to give hope so that the future generations of the Israelites might know that God is working for their salvation. Real quickly, I want you also to recognize that in the 4th prophetic speech of Balaam, we get a messianic prophecy, or what we would understand as a messianic prophecy now through our New Testament eyes and our Jesus lens of looking back on this. He speaks about a star that is going to rise in the future from Israel. And we immediately are connected to, in our minds and our hearts, that Star of Bethlehem imagery on how Jesus was revealed through the Star of Bethlehem. And so this idea that some great leader is going to rise up and bring a great victory to Israel and bring to fruition all of God's plans, we understand that now in the bright and morning star, the one who was witnessed to by the Bethlehem star, our Lord Jesus Christ, the light of the world. The final thing I want to talk about today is from chapter 25, which I understand is out of our readings for this week. It bleeds into our readings for next week. But this ends the story of the first generation of the wilderness wanderings. And in 26, which we'll look at next week, we start with a brand new census. So does this mean that we have, in the first 25 chapters, basically learned nothing, or it has been all for naught? No, I don't think so. I think we have learned very much the importance of staying faithful to God, that God is in control, and that we must stay faithful to Him, and that God is going to accomplish His purposes, whether we say yes to His purposes or not. And we can either be a part of that and be blessed as a part of that, or we can reject God and His purposes and walk away from Him and miss out on that blessing. So my hope is that we will say yes to what God is doing. Finally, Israel falls into idolatry. And this mirrors, of course, the golden calf episode from Exodus, where we saw last week a lot of those stories of the failures of the first generation went back to that pre-Sinai period. Of course, the golden calf was right after Sinai, but still it was very early in their understanding of themselves as the covenant community. And so God was very gracious to them, even though there was some destruction that came from the golden calf episode. But this is even different from that. And if you remember back to the golden calf episode, Aaron made this golden calf to represent the unseen God, Yahweh. Now they are bowing down to graven images of false gods. We see that they worship the false god of Baal of Peor. This is not something that they formed or fashioned to try to understand the God who brought them out of Egypt. They are now just completely given over to idolatry. And they are starting to mix these other people groups into their covenant community. Now we see just a very disturbing example of the judgment of God, one that seems harsh to us, but again, remember, God is trying to raise up this very holy and set apart group of people around pagan, idolatrous cultures, and so God's trying to preserve them so the Messiah can come out of them. But we also see one example of faithfulness in a man named Phinehas, and in fact, Phinehas is the grandson of Aaron. He is the son of Eleazar. He is the priest who is then blessed by God because he stands up for the commandments of God by some means that we would not advocate today. He wipes out this man and woman who brought idolatry into the camp. We would not advocate today a violent response to those things. Again, different culture, different world. God's working within an imperfect culture at that time to bring His promises and His truth and His salvation. We know today not to use those violent means. But Phinehas at least is standing up for faithfulness. And God is honoring the fact that he is standing up in faithfulness for God and God's ways. And so he is blessed as a leader of this future generation, this community that will end up entering into the promised land. We'll see that a little bit later too, as Joshua is raised up as a leader when Moses is unable to go in the promised land. But right now, just remember that what this is teaching us is that number one, God wants us to be faithful and say yes to what he is doing in the world. And secondly, God is gracious. Yes, this first generation has failed, but God is giving Israel a second chance, really a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh chance, and so on, by raising up this new generation. Same thing he did back in the flood with Noah and his family. The same thing he has done throughout history and will continue to do. God is gracious. So yes, we want to be faithful and follow him, and know that his grace will empower you to be faithful and to follow him. We'll take a look next week at how this second generation starts out. Keep up with your reading in Numbers, and remember, God is always faithful to you. Have a great week.